Julie Foudy is one of the greatest figures that U.S. women's soccer has ever produced, a name tied to the historic milestones that changed the status of women in American sports. Over a career spanning nearly 2 decades, she wore the U.S. national team jersey more than 270 times, a number reserved only for the most resilient and utterly trusted players. Julie Foudy was a World Cup champion in 1991, helping lay the foundation for U.S. women's soccer on the world map, and she went on to reach the pinnacle with the World Cup title in 1999, an iconic tournament where more than 90,000 fans filled the Rose Bowl and millions of Americans truly saw the power of women's sports for the first time. She also won 2 Olympic gold medals in 1996 and 2004, becoming one of the very few American female athletes to own such an impressive collection of major titles. As captain of the USWNT from 2000 to 2004, Julie Foudy led the team not just tactically, but with spirit, regarded as the backbone of the golden generation that included legends like Mia Hamm and Christine Lilly. She was inducted into the National Soccer Hall of Fame, praised by U.S. media as the conscience of women's soccer, and after retiring, she continued appearing on ESPN as an influential voice on sports and gender equality. On paper, it was an almost perfect career, full of glory, titles, and historic respect. But behind those numbers and trophies lies a pain that very few have ever asked about. Julie Foudy did not walk away from that career with commensurate wealth, without any real post-career protection or care system, and never had a period where she was truly allowed to rest. She carried not only the responsibility to perform, but also the responsibility to speak out, to confront injustice, and to accept being labeled difficult, so her teammates could be safer. Julie Foudy's pain did not come from a dramatic fall, but from prolonged erosion, a weary body, a gradually depleting spirit, and the constant need to appear strong, even when no one guaranteed they would catch her if she collapsed. It was precisely in that silence that her will was forged. Julie Foudy did not give up, did not step back, did not choose the safe path of staying quiet. She kept standing tall, kept shouldering the load, kept fighting for future generations even when she had nothing left to gain in return. That is the deepest tragedy, but also the greatest dignity of a woman who conquered history, at the cost of her own life. If you want to understand more deeply what Julie Foudy had to sacrifice behind that spotlight, please subscribe to the channel and keep following this never fully told journey. Julie Foudy's childhood had no bruises to recount, no ruined home or nights of hunger and cold dramatic enough to make others cry. She grew up in a typical middle-class California family, where life, from the outside, looked completely stable, orderly, and safely normal. No one beat her, no one abandoned her. There was no tragedy big enough to name, but it was precisely in that quietness that a silent void formed, the void of rare encouragement, of infrequent hugs, of emotions never asked about. Julie Foudy was a good kid, independent early, rarely complaining, and therefore rarely noticed. When she tried hard, adults took it for granted. When she endured, they assumed she was fine. No one stopped to ask whether a girl learning to be strong really needed to be allowed to be weak. In a world where boys were encouraged for being tough, and girls were praised for being well-behaved, Julie Foudy learned a dangerous lesson very early. If you want to survive, it's best not to ask for too much. She found the sports field as a quiet refuge. On the field, you didn't have to talk much, didn't have to explain feelings, just run faster, fight harder, endure longer. Soccer became the only language in which Julie Foudy felt heard, even if it was through heavy breathing and scrapes on her skin. But even there she was not taught that her emotions had value. Lose and swallow it, hurt and get up faster than others, sad and turn it into motivation. No one told her that some sadness doesn't need to become strength, that some tears don't make a person weaker. Gradually, Julie Foudy developed a lifelong psychological pattern. Don't ask, don't complain, stand up on your own. That wasn't chosen resilience, it was resilience she was forced to learn. At school, Julie wasn't the loud standout kid. She didn't vie for attention, didn't show emotions excessively, didn't demand recognition. Success came to her through discipline and quiet effort, but precisely because of that, it was easily overlooked. When a girl does well, people call it normal. When a girl endures, people call it strong. No one realized that behind that calm was a child learning to shrink herself to fit the mold. Julie Foudy was not taught that a woman's voice has weight, that female emotions deserve respect, that speaking pain is not shameful weakness. Instead, she learned to stay silent, to perform better than expected, so as not to become a burden to anyone. It was in those years that the seed tragedy of Julie Foudy began to take root, not the tragedy of loss, but the tragedy of self-erasure. She learned to put others' needs first, to shoulder responsibility instead of sharing it, to stand tall even when no one asked, because if she fell, no one would be there to catch her. The saddest part is that no one intentionally taught her that. The system operated unconsciously, and Julie Foudy was simply a smart enough girl to adapt, strong enough to endure, and quiet enough not to bother anyone. When she left that childhood behind, Julie Foudy carried no clear painful memories, but she carried a dangerous habit, treating self-burden as natural. That habit would become the weapon that helped her survive in the harsh world of sports, but also the silent knife that cut into her inner life for decades to come. She did not grow up feeling unconditionally loved. She grew up believing that love and recognition must be earned through ceaseless effort, and that belief, seemingly harmless in a little girl, became the foundation for a life of constantly bracing herself to stand firm, even when too exhausted to keep going. When Julie Foudy stepped into Stanford, it wasn't just the gateway to a prestigious university, it was the entrance to a brutal grind, where excellence was no longer a reward but an obligation. Here she wasn't allowed to be just a student, nor just an athlete. She had to be both, at the same time, and more, a role model. Stanford tolerated no mediocrity, but also left no room for weakness. In lecture halls full of bright lights and training fields, always smelling of grass, Julie learned to break each day into just enough fragments to survive. Mornings for lectures, afternoons for practice, evenings for recovery and studying, nights for the prolonged silence of a tired body that wasn't allowed to stop. No one explicitly told her she had to be perfect, but everything around her operated as if it were obvious. Studying while competing while being a role model formed a pressure triangle with no escape. Julie understood that every mistake of hers was not just personal, it would be read as proof of the ingrained doubt society held toward women in sports. A bad pass, an off-form game, a low test score, all carried weight far beyond the act itself. She learned to avoid mistakes, and when mistakes were unavoidable, she learned to hide them. There was no space to say I'm tired, no right to admit I'm wobbling. Those words, if spoken, could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness, at Stanford, was a luxury Julie couldn't afford. On the field, she ran more than necessary, fought harder than safe, and kept getting up even when her legs trembled. Off the field, she kept the proper smile, answered interviews with composure beyond her years, and fulfilled the representative role no one officially assigned, but everyone quietly expected. Her body began sending warning signals, nagging pain in her hips and back, mornings waking with muscles heavy as lead, sleepless nights because her heart rate wouldn't drop. But Julie was too accustomed to turning sensations into tasks. Pain? Adjust the training plan. Tired? Sleep less. She didn't see it as sacrifice, she saw it as the standard. Her spirit hardened along with it. The joy of victory didn't last, it was swallowed by the next schedule. Pride in effort had no time to settle, it was replaced by the to-do list. Julie became dangerously good at one skill, detaching emotion from action. It helped her endure, made her reliable, let her go farther than most. But it also quietly drained the necessary space for healing. She didn't allow herself to collapse, because collapsing meant bothering others, and bothering others was something she'd learned to avoid since childhood. At Stanford, praise came late and left quickly. When Julie did well, it was as expected. When she didn't, it was not enough. That expectation wasn't an invisible burden, it was armor she always had to wear, growing heavier with each season. She learned to carry it with calm, to the point of forgetting what bare skin felt like, and in the process, Julie began trading herself away without realizing it, trading quiet afternoons for recovery, trading honest conversations about fear, trading the right to be wrong, to be tired, to be weak. That trade didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened bit by bit, like water dripping on stone. Each day added a demand, each week an expectation, each season a responsibility. Julie never stopped to ask if she wanted to carry it all, because that question was never taught as valid. She only knew that if she stood firm, the system would keep running. If she slowed down, everything might waver. So she chose to stand firm. When she left Stanford, Julie Foudy carried degrees, achievements, and the recognition needed to enter the peak of sports. But she also carried something far heavier, the reflex of self-sacrifice. Stanford had sharpened her talent, but simultaneously worn down the softer edges of a human being. She emerged stronger, more disciplined, more ready for the battles ahead. There was just one thing she didn't realize: the price had started being tallied very early, and it would keep rising, quietly, throughout the rest of her life. When Julie Foudy first put on the U.S. national team jersey, it should have been the most noble moment of an athlete's life. For many, being called up to the USWNT was a lifelong dream, the ultimate recognition of talent and hard work. But for Julie, that moment carried a bitter paradox. She had reached the peak of sports, yet her life was falling below even ordinary levels. The USWNT of the 1980s and 1990s was not the glory machine that later history often portrays. It was a group sustained by honor, by pride, and by the relentless endurance of women who were never prepared by the system to be protected. There was no steady salary, no long-term contracts, no real health insurance. National team call-ups didn't come with peace of mind. They came with a very real question: how am I going to live next month? Julie and her teammates played for their country, but they had to cover every meal, every trip, every recovery expense themselves. There were periods when they left training camp to go back to part-time jobs, just to make sure the rent didn't go overdue. That absurdity was covered up with the two words, honor, as if national pride could substitute for a person's basic security. Medical care was almost a luxury concept. The nagging pains in knees, hips, and back weren't seen as problems to solve, but as things to endure. Injuries were taped up not to heal, but to keep playing. Recovery wasn't a right, it was self-managed. Julie learned to understand her body by instinct, because no team stood behind her to explain or protect. Every time she stepped on the field was a gamble with her own body, and the price often only showed years later, when no cheers could cover up the accumulated exhaustion. Worse than that was the invisibility. The USWNT back then had no voice. Decisions were made in meeting rooms where women were rarely invited to speak. Schedules, training conditions, compensation, all decided without the input of those directly affected. Julie Foudy, even as one of the most important faces on the field, still had to accept a silent role if she wanted to keep getting called up. Every time she spoke out was a time she risked being sidelined, and so silence became a survival strategy, even though it went against the sense of fairness that had been instilled in her from early on. Playing for honor while having no money, no safety, no respect, that was the reality Julie had to face. The flag ceremonies, the emotional national anthems didn't last long. When the music stopped, they returned to rundown locker rooms, economy flights, expenses they had to shoulder alone. The gap between the image of representing the nation and their personal lives became painfully unbelievable. Julie represented America on the field, but in everyday life, she wasn't treated like a true professional athlete. The biggest tragedy lay in this: to survive in that environment, Julie was forced to keep erasing herself. She took on extra responsibility, not just for herself, but for the whole group. When someone needed to speak up, Julie was the one who stepped forward. When the system needed a reliable face, Julie was chosen. The price of that was quiet isolation. She became the one who took the hits for others, the buffer that let the team keep moving forward, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because if she didn't do it, very likely no one would. The peak of sports for Julie Foudy wasn't a launchpad, it was a slippery staircase, where every step forward required double the effort, just to stay in place. She wasn't allowed to fall, because falling meant losing the few opportunities women had back then. And while the outside world gradually got used to seeing Julie in the national team jersey, very few realized she was living a life below ordinary, less secure, less stable, and less protected. That invisibility didn't weaken Julie, it hardened her. But that hardness wasn't pure strength, it was the necessary shell to keep from shattering. With every match that passed, every tournament that ended, she accumulated another layer of endurance. And it was precisely during this period of wearing the national team jersey, while living as an invisible person, that Julie Foudy's tragedy became clearer than ever. She had reached the pinnacle of sports, but the price was a life that didn't match, where glory wasn't enough to protect a person from the prolonged erosion of injustice and being forgotten. When Julie Foudy began to speak out, she had no illusions that it would be welcomed. She understood very clearly the logic of the world she lived in. Women are praised for staying silent, honored for enduring, and doubted the moment they demand more than what's given. But after years of wearing the national team jersey while living as an invisible person, Julie Foudy realized that silence was no longer a neutral choice. Silence at that point meant complicity, and for her, that was a line she could not cross. Julie Foudy spoke out about pay not out of personal ambition, but because the absurdity had stretched to the point of insult. The U.S. women's team won, filled stadiums, brought national prestige, but the compensation they received wasn't even enough to call it a stable career. She said what everyone knew but few dared to voice, that honor can't replace rent, that pride doesn't pay medical bills, and that representing your country shouldn't mean accepting poverty. Those words weren't flowery, didn't ask for sympathy. They were simply raw truth, and that's exactly why they made people uncomfortable. She also spoke out about playing conditions, makeshift training fields, exhausting flights, injuries taken lightly. Julie Foudy named the things the system wanted to hide, that women's bodies were being used to exhaustion without matching protection mechanisms. She didn't speak with anger, nor did she incite. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had endured long enough not to confuse resilience with being exploited. But that very clarity made her a problem that needed to be managed. And then Julie Foudy touched the most sensitive point: gender injustice. She didn't just compare numbers. She questioned the power structure. Who gets to sit in the decision rooms? Who gets listened to? Who is considered professional? And who is seen as asking too much? When she said that women in sports don't need special privileges, but minimum fairness, the response she got wasn't dialogue, it was defensiveness. Doors didn't slam shut, but they closed tightly enough for her to feel it. Conversations weren't cut off, but the tone changed. Invitations appeared less and less. The price of speaking out came quickly, though not loudly. Julie Foudy was labeled troublesome, a word that sounds mild, but in the world of power it carries exclusion. Troublesome means hard to control. Troublesome means inconvenient. Troublesome means best to stay away from. She wasn't publicly punished, wasn't dropped from the roster for a clear reason. Instead, she was avoided behind the scenes. Important discussions happened without her. Decisions were announced after they were already done. She was still there but on the edge. The most painful part was that the isolation didn't just come from the system. Sometimes it came from the very people she was trying to protect, not because they betrayed her, but because they were afraid. Afraid of losing their spot. Afraid of being labeled the same. Afraid of being the next one to bear the consequences. Julie Foudy understood that, and so she didn't blame them. But that understanding didn't make the loneliness any lighter. She gradually became the shield, the one who took the heavy backlash so her teammates could keep playing in relative peace. When tension erupted, Julie's name was mentioned. When a face was needed for dialogue, Julie was called. When someone needed to take responsibility for the excessive demands, Julie was the most convenient choice. The core tragedy of Julie Foudy took shape right here. She wasn't officially asked to carry the load, but she also wasn't allowed to let go. If she stayed silent, injustice continued. If she spoke out, she was isolated. That was the inescapable trap of a leader in a system not ready to change. Every time she stood up, she lost another piece of safety. Every time she protected others, she narrowed her own space to exist. But Julie kept going, not because she believed she would be rewarded, but because she knew the price of doing nothing was even higher. The exhaustion built up in ways that were hard to notice, not the burnout after a single match, but the prolonged spiritual wear. Julie Foudy began to get used to walking into meeting rooms, knowing she wasn't fully welcome. She got used to weighing every word, not to please, but to minimize damage for those behind her. She got used to being seen as a problem to solve rather than a person to listen to. And in that terrifying familiarity, she still stood tall. She carried so others could be at peace. That saying wasn't a lofty slogan. It was the raw truth of Julie Foudy's life. She carried the tension so her teammates could focus on playing. She carried the management's discomfort so others didn't have to face it directly. She carried the role of saying what no one wanted to hear, so other voices could exist in safe silence. That wasn't the role she dreamed of. It was the role she accepted, because no one else stepped up. In the public eye, Julie Foudy gradually came to be seen as a strong leader unafraid to confront. But behind that image was a person growing more and more alone. The isolation didn't make her collapse, but it took away the necessary supports to keep going long term. She didn't complain, because complaining would weaken the message. She didn't withdraw, because withdrawing would leave a void that injustice would rush to fill. So she kept standing there, in the crossfire of opposing pressures, bracing herself to be the support for a movement bigger than herself. And in that choice, Julie Foudy's tragedy was no longer just personal. It became the tragedy of trailblazers in a system not ready to receive them. A woman who dared to speak, dared to face it, dared to accept isolation so others could move forward. There were no applause for that sacrifice, no immediate reward, only the continuation of the fight, and one person who kept carrying it, quietly, so those around her could be a little more at peace, while she herself grew more and more alone. The 1999 World Cup was etched into American history as a pure moment of glory. The image of the Rose Bowl packed with more than 90,000 fans, the cheers rolling like waves, the flags waving, and the feeling that women's soccer stood for the first time at the center of national sports life became a timeless symbol. For millions of Americans, it was the moment they believed women not only deserved to play, but deserved to be honored on equal terms. And in the middle of that historic moment, Julie Foudy stood there as a quiet pillar, a leader who had been around long enough to understand that this victory didn't come from one match, but from an entire decade of sacrifices no one wanted to look straight at. But right in that brilliant light, a bitter paradox emerged. The 1999 World Cup didn't bring Julie Foudy a contract that secured her future. There was no long-term commitment waiting. There was no post-World Cup plan drawn up to protect the people who had just made history. When the final whistle blew, when the trophies were raised, the system was ready to profit from their image, but it was never ready to take responsibility for the life that came after. The victory belonged to the nation, to the media, to the inspiring slogans. But the ones who sacrificed the most were not given even the minimum peace of mind. Julie Foudy understood that better than anyone. She had been through enough seasons to know that glory in American women's sports back then was a light that didn't warm for long. It shone, then went out quickly. And when it went out, the people standing in it had to find their own way forward. No guaranteed contract meant no foundation to pause and recover. No future plan meant no right to choose. So right after the World Cup ended, Julie had to keep fighting, not to win another trophy, but to keep what had just been achieved from slipping away. She kept representing for the national team, for women's soccer, for the values the tournament had just ignited. Interviews followed one after another, long media trips, meetings with sponsors, organizations, people who wanted to capitalize on that historic moment. Julie Foudy became the reliable face, the one who could speak for an entire group, but every time she appeared, she carried an invisible burden. She had to be perfect, calm, inspiring, even when she hadn't had a chance to breathe. There was no pause to digest the victory, no time to ask herself what she was feeling. The price of that was blow after blow, not on the field, but in her mental life. Julie kept taking hits from the new expectations that sprang up after the World Cup. Women's soccer was now getting more attention, which meant every mistake would be scrutinized more closely. Every demand had to be reasonable, gentle, proper, because any firmness could be interpreted as not knowing her place. Julie Foudy, who was used to speaking out, now had to speak in a narrower space, where the glory just won became a reason for others to demand her silence. You already have your win. What more do you want? Glory gradually became a shackle in that way. It bound Julie to the role of symbol, but gave her no right to be tired. She couldn't step back, because stepping back now would be seen as ungrateful. She couldn't slow down, because slowing down meant losing the momentum the movement had just gained. She also couldn't express personal worries, because those worries would be seen as overshadowing the bigger story. So Julie kept stepping forward, kept taking responsibility, kept shouldering pressures that should have been shared by the entire system. The most painful thing about the 1999 World Cup wasn't what happened on the field, but what didn't happen afterward. There was no real restructuring to protect the people who had just made history. There was no clear commitment that from now on they would be treated as true professional athletes. Julie Foudy saw that gap, and she understood that if no one stepped up to fill it, everything would go back to the way it was. So she kept carrying the load. In the public eye, the Julie of 1999 was part of the most glorious moment, but in her inner life, she began to feel the accumulated exhaustion very clearly. Her body needed rest, but the schedule didn't allow it. Her spirit needed recovery, but the responsibilities didn't stop. Every time she appeared as a representative, Julie drained another piece of energy meant for herself, and the irony was that the greater that sacrifice grew, the smaller the chance of being protected became. The 1999 World Cup should have been the end of a long journey, a moment for people like Julie Foudy to pause, to reflect, to lay the foundation for the next chapter of life. But for her it became the starting point for an even heavier phase. The victory didn't free her, it bound her more tightly to the role that history and the public expected. Glory didn't open new doors, it locked shut the doors she might have stepped through to rest. And so, while the whole country celebrated an iconic victory, Julie Foudy quietly kept walking the familiar path. Keep fighting, keep representing, keep taking the hits. No one saw the moments she was alone after the lights went down, when emptiness overpowered pride. No one asked what this victory had taken from her, because in the story, the world wanted to hear, glory was enough. But in the story Julie Foudy was living, glory was just a new shackle, heavier, shinier, and harder to remove than anything she had ever carried before. After the 1999 World Cup, Julie Foudy didn't step off the field as a winner allowed to breathe a sigh of relief. She stepped into the captain's role during a period when every eye was on her, and every expectation was hung on her shoulders, like an obligation she couldn't refuse. Julie Foudy understood very clearly the unwritten rule of the captain's armband. A leader can't be tired, a symbol can't be weak, a voice can't be silent. No one had to say those things out loud. They were present in every meeting, every training session, every time she stepped in front of the media. The armband didn't just tie her arm, it tied her right to be human. Being a leader in a still fragile system meant having to stand firm before even thinking about standing right. Julie didn't just lead the play, she led the spirit, kept the team from slipping off the track it had just reached. Every collective mistake could be magnified into proof of the old doubts about women's sports. And so the captain wasn't allowed to be tired. Tired meant weak. Weak meant not good enough to hold on to what had just been won. Julie learned to bottle up exhaustion in the rare hours no one saw, then step onto the field with straight posture, steady voice, unwavering eyes. Being a symbol was another layer of pressure. A symbol had no right to be wrong, because a symbol's mistake wasn't just personal, it became a story others could tell in ways that suited them. Julie Foudy in that role had to maintain an image not just for herself, but for the entire movement. The smile had to be timed right, the reactions had to be measured, the words had to be strong enough to inspire, but soft enough not to chip away at goodwill. Every day that passed, she became skilled at balancing on a thin wire, where one misstep could bring big consequences. And the price of that skill was the constant draining of mental energy. Being a voice meant she couldn't stay silent. After 1999, the questions about pay, playing conditions, schedules, and benefits didn't disappear, they became more urgent. The outside world had seen the light of the Rose Bowl, and now they demanded continuation. Julie was called on in moments that needed statements, explanations, reassurance. Silence now was seen as evasion, as squandering opportunity. Speaking out brought backlash, criticism, and another layer of stress. Julie chose to speak, because she knew that every time she stayed silent, another door to dialogue closed a little more, but every time she spoke, she also cut away a piece of her own safe space. Her body endured in very specific ways: packed training sessions, endless travel, matches played while still pushing through in complete recovery. Pain became a familiar companion. Julie didn't talk about it, didn't complain, didn't let it surface. She adjusted her breathing, changed her running form, changed her landing, did everything possible to keep standing firm, but physical endurance was only the visible part. The harder part was the quiet draining of her spirit. Her spirit drained in a silent, undramatic way. It was the quieter evenings after big matches, when joy no longer filled the emptiness. It was the feeling of always having to turn on the switch whenever she appeared, even when inside she just wanted quiet. It was the habit of weighing every word before speaking, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Julie Foudy became so good at carrying that she forgot what it felt like to be supported. No one asked how much longer she could hold on. That question didn't appear in the schedule, wasn't in the meeting minutes, wasn't raised in interviews. The system only asked, "Are you ready? Can you keep going? Can you represent?" And because Julie always answered with her actions that she could, the most important question was overlooked. She asked it to herself in silence, then pushed it aside to do what needed doing. Every time she pushed it aside, she traded away another piece of balance. In her captain's role, Julie also became a refuge for others' anxieties. Teammates came to her when pressure rose, when arguments flared, when faith wavered. She listened, reassured, coordinated. She put the group's needs before her own, because that was the only way to keep the team from cracking. But that constant listening had no reciprocal side. Julie rarely had a place to unload, because a captain wasn't allowed to become a burden to anyone. The media lights shone brighter, and with them came incomplete interpretations. Sometimes Julie was seen as too strict, sometimes too political, sometimes not soft enough. Those labels stuck to her, even when they contradicted each other. She understood that was the price of standing at the center, but understanding didn't mean it didn't hurt. Each label was a small scratch, not deep enough to draw blood, but numerous enough to make her mental skin sensitive and weary. The irony is that precisely when Julie stood in the position of symbolic power, she had the least control over her own rhythm of life. The schedule was dictated by collective needs. Public statements were shaped by the political media context. Personal emotions had to give way to the bigger story. She didn't lose herself in a single moment. She was drained bit by bit, and because that process happened slowly, it was easily mistaken for admirable resilience. There were moments, very rare ones, when Julie asked herself if she could stop, but that question was quickly smothered by a heavier one. If I stop, who will stand there? Who will speak? Who will take the hits? In that trap, Julie's choice was always the same. She kept going, not because she wasn't tired, but because she didn't allow herself to be tired. Not because she wasn't weak, but because she wasn't permitted to be weak. Not because she didn't want to stay silent, but because silence would make everything they'd just achieved more fragile. A captain isn't allowed to collapse. That was the invisible premise that governed every day of Julie Foudy's life. And while she kept standing tall to keep the team moving forward, a quiet truth followed her. No one was counting down her endurance. There was no clock to signal when it was time to stop. There was only one person who kept carrying, kept leading, kept serving as the support, while the inside gradually emptied. And right there, Julie's tragedy wasn't in whether she collapsed or not, but in being placed in a role that didn't allow collapse, until the question how much longer can she hold on became too late to ask. After years of carrying the load with the captain's armband, the Olympics came to Julie Foudy not as a promise of joy, but as a task that had to be completed. The two Olympic gold medals, 1996 and 2004, from the outside looked like peaks any athlete would dream of. They symbolized dominance, national standing, victories etched into the history books. But on the other side of that spotlight, Julie stepped onto the field with a completely different feeling from her early days. The weight of responsibility had overtaken the excitement, and the joy that once came naturally now had to be forced. The Olympics were no longer where she went to dream, they were where she went to keep what had been built from crumbling. At the 1996 Olympics, when women's soccer made its first appearance on the Olympic stage, Julie Foudy understood that this wasn't just a tournament, it was a test of the entire movement's existence. Every match carried the question, do women deserve this space? Are they strong enough to fill it? Victory brought instant recognition, but it also brought prolonged pressure. The joy of winning, which should have exploded, was quickly replaced by the next to-do list: interviews, representing the image, defending the position. Julie stood on the medal podium with the proper smile, while inside she had already begun to feel a strange weariness, as if part of her emotions had been locked away to serve the greater goal. By the 2004 Olympics, everything was even clearer. This was the second peak, the affirmation that what they did wasn't a fleeting moment, but precisely because of that, the joy faded even more. Julie Foudy no longer felt the butterflies of a young athlete. She was no longer surprised by the national anthem ringing out, or the cold metal of the medal against her skin. Everything happened as expected, as required. Victory came, but it left no aftertaste. It passed like a procedure rehearsed too many times. The prolonged emptiness didn't appear as a breakdown. Julie didn't collapse, didn't sob in the locker room, didn't lose control in front of the media. On the contrary, she kept everything neat, orderly, proper, just as she always did. But that very neatness hid a more frightening truth. Julie began to feel nothing when she won. Emotions didn't surge up or crash down. They lay flat in an unnatural way. Moments that should have etched themselves into memory just passed by, leaving a void hard to name. Her body kept functioning, but her spirit had shifted to survival mode. Julie focused on details, on tactics, on not making mistakes. She did everything a seasoned leader was supposed to do, but the joy, that initial driving force, was no longer there to fuel her. In its place was a heavy sense of duty. If I don't stand firm, the whole structure could waver. That sense was strong enough to keep her going, but not warm enough to nurture emotion. During those Olympic days, between training sessions and matches, Julie sometimes realized she was searching for feelings she once didn't need to search for. She remembered the days of running on the field with pure excitement, when winning was a reward rather than an obligation, but those memories seemed to belong to someone else, an older version of herself. The current version stood straighter, calmer, and emptier. No one around noticed, because her outward appearance remained perfect. The quietest tragedy of this period wasn't the public pressure, but the disconnection from her own emotions. When winning no longer brought joy, when losing no longer sparked pain, a person steps into a dangerous gray zone. There, everything can be endured, but nothing is truly felt. Julie Foudy walked through 2 Olympics like that, completing the task, upholding the image, protecting the achievements, but each step forward took away a piece of her capacity to feel alive. No one asked Julie if she was still happy. That question seemed inappropriate for a captain who'd just won gold. People asked about tactics, about the team's future, about messages to the younger generation. Julie answered fluently, properly, as she always did. And while the outside world kept celebrating, she gradually realized that the depletion didn't come from a shock, but from repeating victories in a state of emptiness. Julie didn't break down. That was what made everything hard to notice. She didn't collapse for someone to rush in and catch her. She just drained away, bit by bit, in silence. Each medal added to the collection was a reminder that she was paying with her own emotions. And when the Olympics ended, Julie left with 2 gold medals, a reinforced iconic image, and an increasingly clear void inside. That was the quietest tragedy, when victory no longer brought joy, but responsibility still demanded continued winning. Julie Foudy had walked through the Olympics as someone who flawlessly met every expectation. There was just one thing no one saw. Each time she climbed to the peak, she moved a little farther from the vivid feeling that had once made her love soccer. And it was in that prolonged emptiness that Julie's tragedy didn't appear as a fall, but as a path slowly worn deeper, leading her to keep moving forward while the inside quietly dried up. When the Olympics closed, Julie Foudy left the field not through a grand open door, but through a narrow side path almost no one noticed. Retirement came as a necessity, rather than a chosen moment. There was no farewell ceremony commensurate with what she had given, no seats of honor waiting, no promises about who would care for the life after her career, just one woman stepping out of the lights, carrying a weary body and a spirit depleted after years of standing tall for others. Julie Foudy didn't leave amid noise. She slipped out of the frame in the polite silence of a system accustomed to exploiting rather than protecting. The lack of a commensurate farewell was a subtle but deep blow. Those who were once symbols are often expected to understand that their contributions have been recorded in collective memory, but that memory quickly turns to the new. When she was no longer playing, Julie no longer appeared in broadcasts, no longer asked for opinions every week, no longer the center of press conferences. The silence came gradually, not suddenly, like water receding from the sand after the tide goes out. Everything still looked fine, but her footprints began to fade. No post-career care meant no structure for landing. After years of living in a packed schedule where every moment had purpose, Julie stepped into a void not designed for recovery. There was no comprehensive transition program, no specialized medical system to monitor the accumulated effects of injuries and stress, no psychological team ready to listen. What remained was the ingrained habit of endurance. Stand up on your own, adjust on your own, keep moving on your own. But this time there was no next match to hold on to. Going from flag bearer to anonymous was the hardest shift. The one who once led the delegation, represented the nation in front of cameras, now had to learn to slow down in everyday life. No one opened doors for her just because of past fame. No one asked what she needed to recover. Julie faced a cold reality. The system is very good at honoring when it needs an image, and very quick to forget when the image no longer serves the immediate goal. That change didn't look like a fall. It was a long slope where each step was lower than the one before. That quiet drop seeped into the small details. Mornings without roll call for training, afternoons without tactical meetings. The phone rang less, the calendar emptied out. To outsiders that might look like freedom. To Julie it was a silence she hadn't yet learned to live with. When you've grown accustomed to your value being tied to contributions to the group, being separated without a transition ritual feels like having the foundation pulled out from under you, very deep, because the depth of the fall isn't measured by the echo, but by the emptiness it leaves behind. Julie didn't break down publicly. She didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't recount grievances. She did what she had always done, endured in silence. But this silence was different from before. Before, silence was a tactic to keep the team steady. Now silence was the space that forced her to face herself. Questions that had never had room to appear now rose up. If I no longer have that role, who am I? If I no longer have that duty, what do I live for? The lack of post-career care also left material consequences. The body carries the marks of many years at the peak of competition, and needs systematic monitoring and recovery. But that system wasn't there. Julie had to find her own way through a maze of scattered medical appointments, teaching herself to listen to the pain she had always pushed aside before. Every ache reminded her that the years of sacrifice didn't simply vanish when the retirement whistle blew. Mentally, the prolonged emptiness tested what she believed was her resilience. When there were no more victories to cling to, when there was no match schedule to distract, the emptiness that had begun at the Olympics became clearer. Julie didn't lose her way in a dramatic fashion. She lost it quietly, where every passing day needed to be given meaning on her own. The hardest part was accepting that her value was no longer measured by what she could bring to a massive collective. Being left behind by history isn't being erased from the books. It's the feeling of no longer being present in the current story. New faces appear, new victories are told, and the story moves on. Julie stood on the sidelines, watching that flow continue, knowing she had helped create it, but no longer having a place in the frame. That is the painful paradox of trailblazers. When the road is complete, they are often no longer on it. Yet in that deep fall there was one thing no one could take away: the dignity of the way Julie left. She didn't cling to the spotlight. She didn't turn silence into resentment. She chose to face it, slowly, with the consequences of a life devoted. But that choice didn't make the fall lighter. It only made the fall quieter. so the pain unfolded more discreetly, more enduringly. Retirement, for Julie Foudy, wasn't a neatly closed chapter, it was a suspension, where the one who once carried the flag had to learn to walk without it, where the symbol had to learn to live without being named. That fall was very deep because it had no clear bottom. It only had time, and time forced her to rebuild the foundation from scratch. In that silence, the tragedy wasn't that history forgot her, but that history had grown accustomed to letting people like her fend for themselves after completing their mission. And Julie, like many other trailblazers, kept walking in the shadows, carrying the weight of a life that had given too much, with very little prepared to be received in return. Leaving the field, Julie Foudy didn't disappear. She was invited to step onto another stage, media. ESPN opened up as a logical path: continue staying connected to soccer, continue having a voice, continue contributing. From the outside it looked like a smooth transition, but in reality, it was only the continuation of an old pattern in a new form. Julie Foudy didn't step into media with power, she stepped in with responsibility. At ESPN, Julie was quickly recognized as the one who said the hard things. No dodging injustice, no downplaying gender issues, no sugarcoating outdated structures. She analyzed directly, spoke clearly, and upheld the ethical standards she had carried throughout her playing career. The audience trusted her because of that consistency, but trust didn't equal power. Julie had a voice, but she didn't hold decisions. She had credibility, but no authority, to shape the system. That role was painfully familiar. Once again Julie became the one shouldering moral responsibility for a space she didn't control. When debates arose about pay equity, playing conditions, respect for female athletes, she was the one called to clarify, to reassure, to frame the issue properly. The system needed her voice to legitimize the conversation, but not necessarily the action that followed. Julie spoke, the audience listened, and the cycle continued. No real power, that was the core difference from what the public imagined. On screen, Julie appeared with the confidence of someone who had once been at the top, but behind the scenes, she understood her position very clearly: easily replaceable. Media runs on speed and image. Today's voice can be swapped out tomorrow. Experience and depth don't always win against freshness and convenience. Julie held firm to her principles, but that very thing made her not the safest choice in an industry that prioritizes smoothness, a life used by the system to exhaustion. That feeling became clearer when Julie realized the repetition. When she was playing, she was needed for her ability to carry. When she retired, she was needed for her credibility. When she moved to media, she was needed for her ethics. At every stage the system found in Julie a valuable resource, and at every stage the system prepared nothing for when that resource ran dry. This exhaustion didn't come from physical intensity, but from the feeling of being continuously exploited under the name of necessary voice. Julie kept asking herself where the line was between dedication and being used. She didn't want to stay silent, because silence would mean abandoning the values she pursued. But speaking in a space that didn't grant real power was like talking into a room with a glass ceiling. The sound rang out, but it didn't escape. Media demanded constant presence, constant alertness, constant balance. Julie had to keep herself from becoming too sharp and getting sidelined, or too soft and betraying herself. It was the tightrope walk she had known from the field, now replayed on television, and as before, no one asked how much longer she could keep walking that wire. Easily replaceable, that truth hung over every commentator's head, but for Julie, it carried another layer of meaning. She had once been irreplaceable on the field because of her experience and resilience. Now that experience was no longer a shield. The media market doesn't remember long, it seeks immediate fit. Julie understood that one day her voice could be pushed out of prime time, out of the center, out of the main story, and when that day came, there would be no formal tribute, just a polite shift to another face. The tragedy lay in this: even recognizing that Julie kept going, not because she was naive, but because she wasn't used to turning her back on responsibility. A life accustomed to stepping up to say what needed saying made it hard for her to withdraw her voice, even when she knew it might not create commensurate change. The system understood that, and unconsciously, or consciously, kept relying on that dedication. From the field to the studio, the pattern didn't change. Julie Foudy was the carrier, carrying expectations, carrying ethics, carrying the difficult parts others didn't want to take, and as always before, the price wasn't factored into any contract. It was paid gradually through mental wear, through the feeling of always having to hold standards for others, while she herself was increasingly unprotected. Media didn't break Julie, it didn't need to. It just needed to keep operating as it always had, and Julie, with her instinct for responsibility, would drain herself. A life used by the system to exhaustion wasn't because of a lack of awareness, but because of too much devotion in structures not designed to give back. The quiet fall continued, deepening another layer, when she realized that no matter how many stages she changed, her role in the system remained the same, always necessary, but rarely empowered to protect herself. Stepping into the role of mother, Julie Foudy faced a fear for the first time that neither her sports career nor media had ever forced her to confront, not the fear of losing, not the fear of criticism, but the fear of a person no longer standing in a position of control. Having twins didn't come as a victory to be won, but as an all-encompassing reality, where everything happened at once and didn't wait for perfect preparation. Julie Foudy had once led groups through the harshest moments, but in front of two tiny beings, she realized she had no map, no strategy, no right to dictate the rhythm. Her body changed in ways that stunned Julie. New limits appeared without permission. Exhaustion could no longer be suppressed by willpower. Pains came and went with biological rhythms, not training or broadcast schedules. The woman who once believed her body could be controlled by discipline now had to accept a different truth. There were days when just getting up was an effort, and that acceptance didn't come easily. It came with a quiet sense of loss, as if part of her old identity was slipping out of reach. Her psyche wobbled in the wake of those physical changes. Julie was used to knowing what would happen if she prepared enough. Motherhood erased that premise. Sleepless nights blurred the line between day and night. Anxiety crept into seemingly ordinary moments. The question, "Am I doing this right?" appeared frequently, with no clear answers. She had once been the one making final decisions in the highest pressure moments. Now every small choice carried a fragile feeling, because the consequences couldn't be measured by scores or titles. For the first time, Julie wasn't in control. Not of her daily rhythm, not of her emotions, not even of her own exhaustion. The two children decided everything through very instinctual needs. Eat, sleep, cry, need to be held. That shrunken world didn't care about achievements or experience. It only demanded presence, and presence, unlike carrying, couldn't be forced. Julie had to learn to stay in the moment, even when that moment was full of unease. Not leading was a huge shock. For decades, Julie was the one others relied on for direction. Now she had to rely on support around her, had to accept that she couldn't do it all. That dependence stirred up old fears of becoming a burden, of not being strong enough. But motherhood didn't allow those fears to be hidden. The two children didn't need a symbol, they needed a person. And that forced Julie to shed the armor she had worn for too long. Not being strong in the familiar sense was what confused Julie the most. She once believed that strength meant not complaining, meant continuing despite the pain. Now strength meant acknowledging she was overloaded, allowing herself to rest, allowing others to help. That shift wasn't just difficult, it was painful, because it directly challenged the psychological pattern that had helped her survive her entire career. But if she clung to that old pattern, Julie realized she would unintentionally pass on a distorted message to her children about self-worth. Having twins doubled the responsibility in a way that couldn't be avoided. Every decision, every reaction, every moment of exhaustion carried the potential to leave a lasting imprint. Julie had once been accustomed to being responsible for a collective, where mistakes could be fixed in the next match. Motherhood had no next match to make up for anything. Time flowed straight ahead, and every day added another layer of memories for the two children. That reality made the fear more concrete, closer, impossible to dismiss with reason. The greatest fear wasn't about not being good enough, but about letting go. If I stop carrying, will everything collapse? That question had followed Julie from the field to the studio, and now it echoed in the family space. She had once believed stability depended on her standing firm, Motherhood presented a different possibility. Stability could come from sharing, from allowing others to stand in too. Recognizing that didn't erase the fear instantly, but it opened an escape from the old cycle. In those rare quiet moments, Julie faced herself without any role as a shield. No longer the leader, no longer the representative voice, no longer the symbol that had to maintain an image. Just a woman learning to love under imperfect conditions. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became a reminder that her value didn't lie in carrying everything, but in being fully present for the most important relationships. Motherhood didn't redeem Julie from her past, but it forced her to look straight at it. For the first time, she had to confront the core question: if I'm not on the front line, will the world collapse? And in the process of searching for an answer, Julie began to realize a truth that was both terrifying and liberating. Some things still stand firm even when she allows herself to be weak. As the new generation stepped forward, the transition happened faster than any tribute could form. U.S. women's soccer entered a different era, louder, sharper, wrapped and amplified by the media. New faces emerged with the confidence of an era that already had a foundation laid. Megan Rapinoe became the icon of that generation, strong, outspoken, unafraid of conflict, celebrated as the voice of the present. Debates about equality, rights, identity, now had new representative faces, and society was ready to listen to them in ways it hadn't been 2 decades earlier. Julie Foudy stood on the sidelines of that process, not because she no longer cared, but because her role had changed without anyone needing to announce it. Julie Foudy had once been the one saying the hard things when there was no crowd behind her. She had once stepped forward when speaking out meant professional risk. Now those same things were being said again, louder, better protected, and responded to more quickly. That was real progress. But that progress also meant the trailblazers were no longer named in the current story. Julie wasn't bitter. She understood clearly the laws of time and of movements. A movement only matures when it no longer depends on the first ones. She saw in the noise of the new generation a piece of the fruit from those quiet years before. But understanding didn't make the silence any lighter. When you've once stood at the center of a fight, being pushed out of the frame, even naturally, still leaves a void that's hard to name. The difference wasn't just in personality, but in context. The new generation stepped up in an environment that had been better prepared. The media was ready to listen. The public was accustomed to women demanding rights. Organizations were forced to respond. Voices like Megan Rapinoe's were protected by the very weight of the era. Julie recognized that with the clarity of someone who had gone through a harsher phase, but that very clarity made her go quiet, because it reminded her that what she had endured hadn't been fully remembered. Standing on the sidelines didn't mean complete disappearance. Julie still appeared, still analyzed, still supported, but the frequency thinned out. The weight of her presence shifted too. She was no longer the first name called when stories about women's soccer equality flared up. She became a pioneer, a polite but vague title that carried no urgency. In a media flow that always seeks the new, the past, no matter how important, easily gets compressed into a footnote. Not bitter, that was true. Julie didn't speak out demanding recognition. She didn't compare, didn't contrast, didn't recount her contributions, but very quiet, and that quiet held many layers of emotion. Quiet from exhaustion, quiet from being accustomed to stepping aside, quiet from knowing that if she spoke the story might be misinterpreted, quiet from not wanting to become a counterweight to the new generation, the ones she genuinely hoped would have what she never did. The tragedy of trailblazers isn't in lacking victory, but in the fact that victory comes late, and when it does, their names are no longer at the center of the story. The slogans that once got Julie labeled troublesome are now printed on shirts, chanted in the stands. That change deserves celebration, but at the same time it also blurs the memory of the years when saying those slogans came at a cost. Julie witnessed that transformation with mixed feelings: pride in the road she helped open, and emptiness, because she herself was no longer called an essential part of the journey. Forgetting isn't loud. It doesn't come through denial, but through absence. Absence of questions. Absence of invitations. Absence of mentions in summary stories. Julie realized she was living in a strange intersection, Close enough to see the future, far enough to no longer belong to the present. That is a lonely position, where trailblazers often stand, watching the crowd pass along the road they helped create. In private moments, Julie didn't resent the new generation. She understood that every generation needs its own representative faces. But she also understood that history tends to condense. It picks a few names to tell, and lets others fade. That condensation is what makes the tragedy quiet. No one deliberately forgot Julie, but no one actively remembered. The new generation was celebrated, protected, responded to. That should have brought a sense of completion. But for Julie, that feeling came with an unavoidable quiet. When you've spent your life carrying the load, standing on the sidelines without being named anymore isn't punishment, it's consequence. The consequence of going too far ahead, too early in an era not ready to remember fully. The tragedy of trailblazers, therefore, isn't in personal failure. It lies in the truth that history rarely tells their full story. Julie Foudy stood there, not bitter, but very quiet, carrying the awareness that what she did still lives in the present, even as her name gradually faded from it. And in that quiet, she continued to exist like many other trailblazers, not needing applause, but also unable to deny the sadness when realizing the road had grown crowded, while she had been left behind in the shared story. At 55, Julie Foudy still stood firm on the surface. No dramatic illness diagnosis, no medical event that forced headlines, no public collapse that the world had to notice. But that very normalcy hid a more exhausting truth. The body was still there, but worn down. Julie Foudy carried a body that had gone through too many years of endurance without a chance to be repaid. Prolonged fatigue was the baseline feeling. It didn't flare up and disappear. It lay still like a thin fog over every daily activity. Mornings started slower, evenings arrived earlier. Tasks once done unconsciously now required consideration. Julie learned to measure energy like a finite resource, not out of laziness, but because her body no longer allowed unconditional generosity. Every choice of do it or not came with a silent question: do I have enough left for tomorrow? The body bore the marks of sacrifice in the very particular way of elite athletes who went through an unprotected era. Joints spoke up on days when the weather changed. Muscles no longer recovered as quickly. Minor pains appeared and vanished, enough to remind her that every match, every trip, every suppressed pain left a trace. Julie didn't complain. She was used to seeing pain as part of the price paid, but that familiarity didn't make the price lighter. It only made people talk about it less. The spirit, once worn down to emptiness, was no longer in acute depletion, but still carried the dent. Julie was no longer caught in the vortex of having to prove, to represent, to speak out. The settling brought quiet, but it also exposed the emptiness that years of busyness had concealed. Some days that emptiness was a rare peace, other days it was a nameless fatigue, when memories of having carried too much returned like a distant echo. No dramatic illness also meant no moment of permission to stop. Society easily sympathizes with clear falls. It's less patient with quiet erosion. Julie was still healthy by general standards. She still functioned, still appeared, still contributed in fitting ways. But the wear didn't need certification to exist. It was present in breaths that needed more attention, in schedules that had to be arranged more gently, in accepting that she was no longer the one who could take on more. At this age, Julie began looking back at the path she had taken with a new honesty, not to blame, but to understand. She understood that she had lived in an era that forced women to prove twice as much to be recognized half as much. She understood that discipline and endurance had helped her survive, but also taken away many necessary opportunities to rest. That awareness didn't turn into bitterness. It became caution toward herself. The body was still there but worn down. This didn't mean helplessness. It meant adjustment. Julie learned to listen to the small signals she had once ignored, learned to say no earlier, before her body had to speak for her, learned to put her health and peace before the invisible expectations of others. These lessons came late, but they weren't meaningless. They marked a shift from survival to preservation. The spirit, once emptied, now found small anchors. Not big projects or new titles, but a pace of life slow enough to feel. Ordinary moments gained more value when energy was no longer abundant. Julie no longer sought the feeling of victory, she sought a kinder endurance toward herself. That might sound modest, but for someone who once lived by pushing past limits, it was a profound redefinition. She didn't collapse. That's the truth. Julie wasn't brought down by illness or crisis. She didn't need to be lifted up to stand again, but she was depleted. That's also the truth. Depleted in the sense that she had used nearly all the reserves of a lifetime of carrying. Depleted in the sense that she needed to live differently so the rest wouldn't be taken too. Those two truths existed side by side, without contradiction, without needing to choose one. At 55, Julie Foudy stands as evidence of the long-term price of silent sacrifice. There is no loud tragedy to close the story, just one person continuing to walk, slower, more cautiously, with a body carrying the memory of many years at the front line. That wear doesn't diminish the value of what she did. It reminds us that that value was paid with very real parts of body and spirit, and in that truth, there is a quiet dignity, the dignity of someone who didn't collapse, but also didn't pretend to still be whole, the dignity of acknowledging fatigue without dramatizing it, the dignity of a person who had gone far enough to understand that strength isn't only in enduring more, but in knowing when to stop so the rest of life isn't further eroded. The legacy of U.S. women's soccer wasn't built in one night, and certainly not created solely by glorious moments on big stages. It was formed from blood, sweat, and the prolonged silence of those who came before. At the center of that process, though rarely placed in the spotlight, is Julie Foudy. She wasn't the one who appeared most on posters, nor the first face mentioned when celebrations erupted. But the foundation that U.S. women's soccer stands on today bears her clear fingerprints. Pay equity, a concept now shouted, litigated, headlined, was once taboo. There was a time when mentioning salary in women's soccer was seen as ungrateful, overly ambitious, disruptive to the spirit of dedication. Julie Foudy spoke about it when the price of speaking was isolation. She had no safety net, no legal team ready to back her, only arguments, professional ethics, and unyielding resolve. Those conversations didn't bring immediate results, but they laid the groundwork for the language later generations could use to demand. Athlete rights for women, from training conditions, medical care, to voice in decisions, didn't come naturally. Before becoming policy, they were dismissed demands. Julie stood in meeting rooms where the familiar answer was not yet. She repeated those demands many times, not because she believed the next time would be different, but because she understood silence meant acceptance. Each time she spoke, she placed herself in a more awkward position within the group. But those very awkward moments gradually created precedent. Female athletes have the right to ask, to challenge, to do more than just be grateful. U.S. women's sports standing strong today is the result of a long chain of sacrifices not fully credited. Better contracts, safer conditions, greater respect, all bear traces of past tense conversations. Julie Foudy wasn't the only contributor, but she was one of the most persistent during the hardest phase. She carried the role of saying what no one wanted to hear, when the system wasn't ready to listen, and when the system finally changed, the story was retold in a cleaner way, with less mention of those rough years. Legacy built on silence, that is the painful paradox. Silence not because there was nothing to say, but because speaking too soon would slam the door shut. Julie learned to choose timing, language, battles. She stayed silent when needed to keep the door cracked. She spoke when silence would mean giving up. That silence wasn't cowardice, it was a survival tactic in an unfair structure, but because it was tactical, it was hard to honor like louder actions. When the new generation stands on stage, they stand on a reinforced floor. Bright lights shine down, and the story often starts there. Few look back at the foundation, where the first bricks were laid in scarcity and doubt. Julie Foudy stands at that boundary, close enough to know she helped create the floor, far enough not to be invited on stage. That isn't deliberate injustice, it's how history often works, choosing the easier to tell moments over the harder to remember process. The foundation builders don't stand on stage, that truth doesn't shrink Julie's legacy, but it makes the sadness quiet. She sees things she once fought for now becoming standard. She hears old arguments repeated with more confident tones, received more warmly, and she understands this is a sign of success, but that success comes with a void, the feeling of being disconnected from the story she helped write. Julie doesn't demand belated recognition. She doesn't need statues or her name on every milestone. What she carries is the inner certainty that what she did mattered. But that certainty doesn't erase the reality that systems rarely care well for foundation builders after the building is complete. Celebrations are usually for those on top, not for those at the base, and Julie somehow accepted that role very early. Legacy, therefore, has two layers. The surface layer is policies, legal wins, improved contracts. The deeper layer is the story of people who paid the price so those policies could exist. Julie Foudy belongs to that deeper layer. She is proof that lasting change rarely comes from one explosive moment. It comes from long-term persistence, from accepting misunderstanding, from years outside the lights. At this point in her life, Julie looks at legacy not by measures of titles. She looks at it through the stability later generations enjoy, through questions once avoided now asked openly, through female athletes no longer having to beg for basic rights. Those changes don't carry her name in headlines, but they carry the breath of conversations she once opened. Legacy built from blood, sweat, and silence is therefore not a slogan. It is the most honest summary of how U.S. women's soccer reached the present, and in that summary, Julie Foudy appears as a resilient vein, not flashy, not loud, but holding the structure together. The foundation builder doesn't stand on stage, but without them, the stage couldn't stand firm for anyone else to step up. She didn't collapse, but she paid the full price. That isn't a dramatic conclusion, but the rawest truth. When looking back at Julie Foudy's life, after more than half a century existing in structures not built with space for women who dared stand tall, there is no final victory to close this story. No miracle appears at the end to soothe every loss. Only an American woman remains, who lived true to what she believed, and never betrayed herself, even when the price stretched across a lifetime. Julie Foudy steps out of the story, not as a legend cradled by history, but as a person who completed her part in silence. Julie wasn't granted a moment of being saved. There was no chapter where every sacrifice was suddenly fully repaid. Instead, her life was a long chain of hard choices, where every right step took away a piece of personal safety. She chose to speak when silence was easier. She chose to carry responsibility when withdrawing hurt less. She chose to live right even when it left her alone. Those choices didn't lead her to dazzling personal glory, but they preserved something more precious: inner integrity. No ending with victory. Because victory for Julie was never the final destination. The medals came and went. The applause rose and fell. What remains isn't the record, but a worn body, a once depleted spirit, and a life used nearly to its limit. Julie understood very clearly that history loves easy-to-tell moments. It loves climaxes, shining symbols, stories with neat endings. Her life didn't provide that. It provided endurance, something hard to package into a headline. No miracle, because no moment made everything suddenly light. No day Julie woke up to find the years of carrying repaid. What she received was the slow progress of a system, often arriving after she had passed the harshest phase. The miracle, if any, lay in her not losing herself in the process. In a world that easily makes people compromise to survive, Julie never compromised her core values. Only one American woman. That statement doesn't diminish Julie's legacy. It places it in its rightful human position. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't perfect. She was tired, afraid, once empty, once worn down to the point of feeling no victory at all. But it was precisely in those states that she still held on to her moral compass. She didn't betray herself to breathe easier. She didn't change her tone to be accepted faster. She didn't stay silent when she knew silence would make others pay the price later. At 55, Julie doesn't stand on a high podium to be praised. She stands in everyday life, with a worn body and a spirit learning to preserve what's left. Her existence doesn't need to be framed as legend. It is self-sufficient, through a rare consistency in a world that often encourages people to pivot when obstacles appear. Julie didn't pivot. She walked the full path she chose, even knowing that path promised no embrace from history. Some people aren't embraced by history. That isn't failure. It's the fate of those who arrived too early, who stood up when the crowd wasn't ready to stand with them. They create space for the next generation to step in, but precisely because of that, they are often pushed out of the frame when the story is retold. Julie Foudy is one of those people. She isn't the main character in the condensed version of history, but history stands because of people like her, people who accept fading so the overall structure doesn't collapse. She didn't collapse, because collapsing would make all prior sacrifices meaningless, but she paid the full price, because no one can go through what Julie went through without leaving marks. That price was paid with her body, with loneliness, with not being named at the right time. That price was also paid with the rare peace of knowing she never betrayed herself. That is a quiet peace, needing no external validation, but enough for a person to keep living without turning away from the past. If this story leaves anything with the reader, it isn't a promise of a beautiful ending. It is a reminder that some lives aren't born to be celebrated, but to serve as the foundation. And serving as the foundation isn't a lowly role. It is the hardest, most costly, and least thanked role. Julie Foudy lived that role fully, not perfectly, not embraced, but courageous enough to stand firm, honest enough not to turn her back on herself, and resilient enough for history to stand on the foundation she left behind. The story of Julie Foudy leaves a quiet sadness, not because she failed, but because she won too many times without being shielded. The most heartbreaking part isn't the grueling matches or the years of playing without pay, without insurance, but the chain of small repeated details throughout the story, from having to speak out about pay equity while being isolated, becoming the shield for teammates, to retiring without a commensurate farewell, then continuing to be used by the media system as a moral compass, without real power granted. Julie Foudy wasn't pushed down, she was eroded. Even more poignant is the post-peak phase, when the 1999 World Cup and 2 Olympic golds brought no joy, only emptiness, when the new generation like Megan Rapinoe was celebrated, protected, while Julie quietly stood on the sidelines, not bitter but deeply alone. Her body at 55 carries no dramatic illness, but is full of traces of sacrifice. Her spirit didn't collapse, but was once depleted to the point where victory felt like nothing. And in her life as a mother, for the first time Julie faced a primal fear: if I stop carrying, will everything collapse? Honoring Julie Foudy isn't by turning her into a perfect legend, but by looking straight at the price she paid so U.S. women's sports could stand strong today. The lesson for Americans is clear and very real. Society needs progress not just by praising winners, but by caring for foundation builders. It needs to learn to protect those who dared speak early, before they are used to exhaustion and quietly disappear. True fairness isn't only in the final outcome, but in how we treat those who sacrificed so that outcome could exist. If the story of Julie Foudy makes you go quiet and think about the real price of fairness, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling the journeys history never embraced. Thank you for listening to the very last second, and see you in the next video where we will continue to honor those who stood as the foundation so the world could stand firm.